Send Help is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
We're somewhere in the Gulf of Thailand.
Getting us out of here should be your focus. I'm your boss. You work for me.
We're not in the office anymore.
It's bold, relentless, and endlessly rewatchable. Discover why critics give it 93% on Rotten Tomatoes.
You're so fired.
Oh, am I? No help is coming.
Send Help, rated R, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
So again, I want us to think about empowerment and sexuality in less commodified ways, and thinking about how we can use some of the tools presented in the book, especially connecting our sexualities to the kind of social world and the political landscape, how we can use that kind of new framework to better understand ourselves.
Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. It's Andrew. I am so excited to let you all know that we are now in the top 40 best liberal arts podcasts list that got sent to me, and we're number 3. So thank you all for listening to the podcast. And I just really appreciate that you keep spreading the word. So please make sure you follow us on social media. Instagram is Ivory Tower Boiler Room, TikTok, Dr.Andrew and please review us on Apple, Spotify. It really, all of it helps. So I hope you just enjoy this episode. And as always, remember, there is an ad-free version on our Patreon. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. It is Pride Month. It's Dr. Andrew Rimby, joined with someone who I'm so excited to speak with, not because, you know, they're also at Stony Brook where I got my PhD, but I had just talked to Angela Jones about their work camming and how I had discovered it at the Stony Brook Library. So it's like all roads lead back
Full
somehow.
circle.
So if you don't know of Angela Jones, I mean, you're in for a treat. Angela Jones is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Stony Brook. Their work focuses on African American political thought and protest, feminist theory, gender, race, sexuality, and sex work. They've written or edited 10 books, so quite a great collection, including Black Lives Matter, a reference handbook, and camming. They live in Suffolk County. We were reminiscing, well, I was reminiscing about the nature there, you know, all the different variables there. So I'm so excited to talk about sex in public, the transformative social power of our erotic lives, which, as you're listening to this, has just come out. So welcome to the show, Angela.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. Very excited.
So I was watching some of your social media videos, and you say you always get asked about like what inspired you to write this, or like how did this project came to be. But I kind of am curious if we can step back before the book. How did you just become interested in this field that we call sexuality studies?
Ooh, I love this question. And I think there's a personal story, which I want to tell, but I'll start with the academic answer, which is just to say that I started out my career, which you alluded to in my bio. So my dissertation was about kind of early civil rights history. I have a background in studying Black protests in the context of the US. And so a lot of my interest in sexuality and desire academically, intellectually, initially in some ways came from my students. So you mentioned the book on camming. So when I first started writing about sex work, it was honestly because a number of students who had taken several classes with me, who I built a rapport with, had made these disclosures to me that they were working in sex industries. And the way that they were describing that labor was really interesting to me. And so I was like, wait, like maybe there's a project in here. This is a bit of a pivot for me, but I'm always somebody who's been interested in learning more about sexuality in my private life. Is this something that I should or could actually be doing in my academic life? Because in my private life, as somebody who has been always kind of unapologetically, you know, queer and adventurous, certainly by societal standards, learning more about sexuality, learning more about my body has always been very important to me. The bodies of others, the sexualities of others. being in community as somebody with lived experience and a background in sex industries, right? Like just hanging around with sex workers, hanging around with queer people all of my life, so in my private life, I've gravitated toward learning more, but it really wasn't until I started talking more to my students about sexuality in the classroom and outside of the classroom that I was like, wait, I think this is the pivot. I think this is the next thing.
Well, and we were talking about like how the teaching informs research, and I think that's a great lesson right there is how like your students themselves helps guide you into an arena to study.
Absolutely. And I think there's so many of the conversations that I have with students on a regular basis, and especially now that I'm more in at Stony Brook teaching courses on sexuality, sex work, sexuality more broadly. And it's the conversations that I have in the classroom and what they get really excited about and what they get really, what I see fires them up. I'm like, oh, okay. So when we talk about consent, you guys get really excited. When we talk about, and especially this past semester, I remember I was just talking to students about asexuality. I was talking to students about disability and sexuality, and just I think thinking about sexuality transnationally and in international ways. My students were getting really excited, and I said, "Okay, this is also driving some of my approach to how I approach the research that I'm doing." Right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, did that kind of inform what I love about your book is this lived experience memoir-ist type style that you have at the beginning?
Mhm.
Like, was that something near and dear to you, was to try to get your personal voice out on the page, even about your own sexual awakening? And like,
Mm.
you have this great moment with your mom giving you Playgirl and like
Right.
showing you the new male body. I mean, I was
Uh-huh.
like, ding, ding,
Yeah.
ding, this is
Ding, ding.
very interesting.
And as I write, she probably regretted that later because of what I then did with those pictures, which I can talk about, give folks a little insight as to what we're kikiing about. Um, but yeah, so I think, well, actually, let's start there. So I reflect a little bit in the introduction of the book, talking a little bit about my own sexual literacy, because one of my core objectives in this book is just to write something that feels helpful to people, right? That can help them better understand their sexualities, and their bodies, because I know that for me, my mom did her best, right? And so she was a public school teacher. She was this kind of free love activist and activist in the 60s. Anyway, and so it was very important to her that I understood my body. And so for folks listening and watching, what Andrew was alluding to is that my mom said, well, because we started with our World Book encyclopedias. I'm not sure if everybody would remember what those look like, right? But we had these hard book encyclopedias, and she'd showed me these overlays of what human anatomy looked like, right? In our house, we didn't use euphemisms. She used clinical language to talk about bodies. But I guess there was something about those conversations that felt very clinical to her. And so she decided, I don't remember if I was about 10 years old, that she was going to buy me a Playgirl magazine such that I should see real, right? Men's bodies. Anyway, and so I do often lead with some of these personal stories because, as much as I'm an academic, as much as my research is important to me, as much as a lot of this book is about introducing contemporary cutting edge research to the public, listen, statistics data is not always the juiciest read, right? And so I think that is why so much of this book is animated by sexual rule breakers around the world. It's why I share some of my own experience with people, because I hope that people can see themselves in those stories. And I will tell you one more thing about that, Andrew, that feels important is I have used what in academia we often call autoethnographic reflections, right? So the centering of our lived experience as data. And I have played with that throughout quite a bit of my writing, especially since tenure. But this is probably the most vulnerable thing that I've ever written. Like there are stories in here that I didn't actually set out to tell, right? I didn't know I was going to tell, but there was something that was happening in the writing process that really just inspired me to share really vulnerably, right? Because in some ways, if I'm asking people to be really vulnerable, if I'm going to ask you to show me yours, then I'm going to show you mine, right?
Yeah, yeah. As they say in a chorus line. I think that's a
Right?
part of the musical. I'm a musical lover. But yeah. So I mean, I consider your voice like this um auto theory. Like I always remember being introduced to it, like through, you mentioned Not Gay, the Jane Ward book, you mentioned Brittany Cooper. I'm thinking also Elaine Castillo's like book about like why read. And I just think these like voices, it really matters when you connect to your reader. And like I had a conversation recently with an academic about like why academic writing, his whole point is to make it enjoyable to read. And you think, oh wait, like we love reading. Why aren't all academic books interesting to read? Like, it's okay to connect, or you should connect to your readers and think about them. And I appreciate that your voice, you really put that out there.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. And I think maybe for some people this is a hot take. It doesn't sound like it'll be one for you, Andrew. But I think that a lot of academic writing is boring. And I think in some ways sometimes it's actually not technically even good writing, right? But I say that to say that I think sometimes as academics we are so beholden to really conservative epistemological, methodological writing practices, right? Like there are these norms that govern how we conduct research and how we write. And sometimes those norms, they're so constraining. And so in some ways, this dovetails really nicely with the spirit of the book, which is like, be you, be authentic, be yourself. And I have just found over the years where I've had to give myself permission to be myself and to be creative, to be as authentic as possible in the writing process, even if that means that I am pushing back on certain norms and conventions that many of my colleagues, maybe less so in WGSS, but like in academia more broadly, hold, so cling so tight to.
Yeah. I was thinking of Maggie, is it Maggie Nelson's The
The
Argonaut?
Argonauts.
Oh my goodness. When I read that in my PhD experience with Mariana Hirsch at Columbia, I was like, um, this is incredible. Like, and I had taken um the course at Columbia because it was like about feminist and queer literary studies and theory. And
Mhm.
I always like suggest, like, if you can take a course at another university, just that kind of experience back and forth to, I mean, what you're doing in your work too, to like go outside of your bubble, to like really try and see what sticks, what works. Like for
Yeah.
you, what is it about? And I know you talk about it in your book,
Yeah,
so
sure.
I want everyone to read it in the book, but like Jane Ward's Not Gay. Like, why do you think that that's a book we still, in academics, but the popular public? I remember carrying that book around,
Mm.
and someone who was an undergrad said, "Wait, can I look at this? Like, what does this mean? Like, you're not gay, but they're straight men, and they're
Mhm.
still engaging in same-sex activity. Like, there's something, yeah, it's that like aha moment that like really you want to pick it up and read it."
Yeah. Well, one, I want to just hat tip for a second to Jane Ward and to anybody who's listening, watching. In addition to Not Gay, her book, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality, is also, I think,
Mm.
a must read. And so I think that I want to credit her writing, her research, because there's a fearlessness, there's an unapologetic way that she approaches the subject matter. She is not afraid to ruffle some feathers, right? Like there are very specific communities, I would say, I think, especially amongst some gay men who were not particularly happy with that particular book and had much criticism for her. But I think that is just to say that I think she writes authentically and unapologetically, which I think is really important in this space. But I think the point of that book and that I draw from in this work too, that I think is important for people to understand is that when people think about kind of sexual identities, so in sexuality studies, we often talk about this kind of trifecta of sexuality, right? Or what some scholars have called the sexuality prism, which is to say that people primarily understand your sexuality through the framework of desire, behavior, and identity. And for many people, they feel like those things should line up perfectly, right? So if we're thinking in the language of desire or attraction, if you are attracted to, I don't know, cisgender men, right, that like that should also line up with, the behaviors that you engage with and thus your identities. And so what especially feminist sociologists have characterized as sexual discordance, which is just to say, I don't mean to be so nerdy about all this, but it's just
Oh,
to
I
say,
love it. Yeah, go,
is
go,
just
go.
to
Keep
say
going.
that those things don't always line up.
Hmm.
And it really makes people uncomfortable. So in the case of Ward's book and in Not Gay, and there's, subsequently a whole bunch of literature that looks specifically at men who hook up with other men and don't necessarily identify as gay. And people are like, oh, you're in the closet. What do you It's like, slow down for a moment, because our sexuality isn't just about who we do or do not have sex with, or who we do or do not have relationships with. There are these other facets of our identity that are really important. And there's a cultural life and a cultural dimension to sexuality that's really important. So for a lot of the dudes in Jane Ward's book, in Tony Silva's work and in other people's work, a lot of these men will say, look, yeah, sure, every once in a while I meet somebody online and I go and I participate in this circle jerk, or we just, we hang out and we hook up, but I'm not gay because, I don't spend time in the neighborhood. I'm not off on Fire Island. I'm not, right? I'm not part of, LGBTQ politics and communities, right? And sort of just saying, listen, that I occasionally have one-off sexual experiences with other men, it doesn't necessarily make me gay, because to be gay is about so much more than who people have sex with. And I think there's something about that idea that really ruffles people's feathers, right?
Yeah, yeah. And like you have me thinking a lot about how Judith Butler's work has really become so public, right? And like Judith Butler's whole career is interesting to see in publication because it was more confined to the ivory tower type of community. And then now I see Who's Afraid of Gender everywhere, like every
It's
bookstore. And
great.
it's exciting. I'm like, Judith Butler, is understanding that to make a connection, it's kind of like what you asked at the beginning of your book, Angela. And I was like, highlighting so much when you asked this question about, okay, if a cisgender man is interested in both cisgender women and trans women, what does that say about their sexuality? And I'm like, what does that say? I don't know. Like, it's those kinds of questions that I think are really interesting because it kind of shows us the messiness around sexual categories. Like you said, not just fitting into, say, one box or,
Absolutely.
you know, if you bring up the Kinsey scale, oh, I'm always on this side of the Kinsey scale or that side. Like, what are your thoughts about the way the Kinsey scale has kind of become nomenclature in everyday
Yeah.
language?
Um, I'll start with the generous part of my answer, which is just to say, even going back to the way you were talking about Judith Butler's work and their work, I get really excited when I see academics publishing for and writing for mainstream audiences. So when I think about Kinsey's work, when I think about Butler's work, a number of people's work, and the fact that that work is in mainstream public discourse, yay. What I mean, isn't that what we're doing here, right? Like, I
Hmm.
don't love the idea of academics writing in these silos, right? And you're writing a book that, I don't know, maybe 75, or if you're lucky, 400 other academics are going to read. I think we're constantly conducting research and doing writing that is really important. And especially when it comes to gender and sexuality in this current political, geopolitical landscape, more so than ever, we need to be communicating directly with mainstream publics about sexuality, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, like, do you think that like you're talking about, and I, wholeheartedly agree about we become so specialized in fields. Who better than to talk to the public? Like, who better than to give that knowledge and disseminate and have conversations? You know, we could talk all day with other academics and we'll
Right,
understand the jargon,
right.
but like, I feel like the breakthrough moments are when you have those conversations and there's light bulb moments. Like even I'm sure you get asked, like if you talk about, I'm a sexuality studies scholar, I study gender, like general public may think, why study that? Like what's there to study? Like do you ever face that kind of backlash or kind of feel that sometimes you have to explain what you do? Like how do you
Hmm.
approach those conversations?
Hmm. they want to latch onto this in a couple of different ways. One, I think maybe this is why also going back to our conversations about auto theory and autoethnography, I think especially when it comes to subject matter like sexuality, that can make some people, certainly not all, to uncomfortable to varying degrees. I think that's why some of the personal disclosures are very important, right? To kind of have those vulnerabilities with people, but to also say that my expertise doesn't just come from the books over there on my shelf that I read. They also come from lived experience. They come from years of spending time in community. It's why so much of this book is animated by people who break sexual taboos, because who better to learn about sexuality from people who are constantly breaking those norms, right? And living authentically. I think when I think about this pushback to studying gender and sexuality, or maybe not being seen as kind of a legitimate science, I think that comes from a number of different directions. Like I've seen this happen in academic context, right? So, for example, when I first started studying sex work, and I hear this from, unfortunately, from graduate students that I work with, and not necessarily in my own institution, right? Like, so I'll often work with graduate students who are not at my institution because there's nobody in their department who does that. Or they reach out to me to tell me that their advisors are discouraging them from writing about sexuality, and especially topics like I often have students who come to me because they want to write about sex work, or they want to write about kink and BDSM. And even in the context of a relatively progressive discipline, think like sociology, right? Like they're coming to me and saying like their advisors are telling them you probably shouldn't do that, right? Is there something else that interests you? You're not going to get a job. There's too much stigma. For anybody who's interested, there's some really in sexuality studies classic work by Janice Irvine where she talks about sexuality's work as a form of academic dirty work,
Mm.
right? That is so highly stigmatized. The type of experiences we have with IRBs when we go to get ethics approval. We could have an entire episode around some of the really inappropriate and occasionally offensive things that have come up in the context of IRB, but it's because of the subject matter, right? And those IRBs are made up with people who have certain sensitivities around sexuality. Um, and I think certainly if we're talking about the US context, we are living in a moment, and I would say, around the world, actually, we're seeing the rise of kind of fascist and authoritarian regimes. And one of the first things those regimes often do is attack gender and sexuality, right? And so they certainly don't want scientists. We see all of the cutting of NIH funding and NSF funding, by the US government because we don't want people being more educated, or they don't, being more educated about gender and sexuality, especially in ways that are committed to agency and resistance
Mm.
to power structures.
Yeah, and I think that, one only look at Magnus Hirschfeld and like what happened to the literal like burning of sexual texts. And I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many unfortunate examples like that. But what I think is so interesting also in your work, Angela, is what you're doing with decentering like a white kind
Mhm.
of body in terms of
Yep.
sexuality. Like, and I know this also comes like from your own identity, but like, why do you think it's also so important to look at, say, queer black bodies, to look at indigenous sexualities, to look at, you know, cultures that don't just like nicely map onto a white liberal, you
Mhm.
know, body when it comes to
Yeah.
sexuality, which can happen a lot. As we get closer to Pride Month, the Gay and Lesbian Review has a brand new magazine celebrating all things Pride in a special issue called Homo Literarius. So it's all about playing on that idea of homo and the Latin root, which the Latin word homo means person. So not just homosexuality, but how LGBT figures have celebrated one another, have read each other, the lovers that they've had who've also helped inspire their creativity. It is a really interesting issue that includes articles about James Baldwin in Turkey, the gays who kill genre. Think about Thomas Ripley or Hitchcock's Rope, or Drew Drogi's Messy White Gays. Christopher Street, a fellow LGBT magazine, just turned 50. So there's an article about how Christopher Street came to be. So much is in this issue, and I can't wait for you all to get your hands on it. You can read the digital issue or you can get the print magazine. Head to glreview.org, use the promo code ITBR Choice for a free issue of the magazine, and I know you all are going to absolutely love it as much as I do.
I love this question. I would say for me, it was very important, and this word, I want to say inclusive, but I know that might bristle a little bit. But I think inclusivity was really important to me here, and I think decentering kind of typical ways that people often think about sexuality was very important to me. And so, for example, it was really important to center eroticism and not just sex, just as another example. And I promise I'm going to come to the
Yeah, yeah.
the other aspects of subjectivity in a moment. But I think, I want to be inclusive of people who exist across the kind of asexual and allosexual spectrum, right? Making space for people who enjoy various forms of eroticism, even if they don't necessarily typically look like sex, right? Or the traditional kind of ways that people think about sex. I want to decenter kind of whiteness in the way that we think about sexuality. Put another way, and something I say throughout the book is that I want us to at least have conversations about how race shapes sexuality, right? Because I think sometimes there's a lot of this. I am open, right? I want us to have more honest conversations about how race shapes our sexuality. But I'll give you an example because you asked specifically about kind of decentering whiteness. So in the chapter on relationships, I center non-monogamy, specifically centering polyamory, and I do so by kind of really highlighting and foregrounding the experiences and the work of Black polyamorous educators, who many of whom are online. They are on all of the social media spaces doing lots of unpaid educational work. And in some ways, I just want to give those folks their flowers, right? Because they are online doing the hard work of educating a lot of people. And I think leading a lot of people to more erotic empowerment and more pleasure. And so for that, I just want to kind of celebrate those folks. But I think there are a lot of communities in which the kind of public spokespeople of those groups very often historically have been white, right? So we see this argument come up in the chapter on desire where I center ace folks, right? And so a lot of those communities have also very often, especially publicly, have been very kind of whitewashed, or at least the spokespeople for those communities often seem white. And so it felt very important, especially in the context of this chapter, to center those folks' experiences. But more broadly, I think in this, again, you'll see throughout the book, I think it's very important to center the experiences of marginalized people. And you see this throughout the book because I think that marginalized people have so much to teach us about various aspects of our sexualities, right? And so people who have been kind of marginalized by various systems, whether we're talking about heteropatriarchy, whether we're talking about white supremacy, like those people are best poised. They're in the most I don't know, propitious kind of vantage point from which to demystify how those systems of power work. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the trans of color community, like listening to Laverne Cox, listening to Peppermint, listening to, I mean, so many, like, Alexandra Billings. I mean, there's so many amazing trans activists, but like how they're on the front lines of any backlash towards the LGBTQ community. Like, I get so pissed off when like white gay men, which I'm part of the group, so I can say it, like will claim, "Oh, I'm not being affected right now, so everything's fine politically." And it's like, okay, to even make that statement, it's like the same kind of statement that, second wave feminists would make about, I have all this income from my husband. I feel really bored. Um, maybe I should do something on the side. And it's like, well, how about the women of color and others who have economic conditions where they can't make that privileged statement?
hmm
You know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what you're describing is this kind of invitation for all of us to think about our sexualities through an intersectional framework, right? Which is to say, when you think about your sexuality, I want everybody to think very deeply and meaningfully about how your race nationality, right? Where you live in the world, where you come from, the cultural backgrounds you come from, your age, your gender, your sexuality, your class, your ability, your immigration status, right? Like how all of these social locations and our respective social locations in overlapping systems of power, how that shapes our sexualities, right? Because we don't all experience our sexual lives, our erotic lives in the same way. And all of those facets of social experience shape how we experience, how we do sexuality.
Yeah, and I love what you do with like these terms erotic empowerment and sexual liberation. And I feel like you've had me really shift, providing not just this language, but and you stress this in your work, but like knowing that I was going to talk to you
Yeah.
to address that, I feel like there's like a segment of America, and I think we see this with like those who are holding on to such supremacist beliefs, white supremacist beliefs, like that they fear like just including more groups, including more that they have to like challenge themselves to learn more. And it's just no one is saying like don't read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique or don't, read Gay White Men. It's like, well, let's look at their work in context, provide you can critique it, you can add on to it, but like also read Angela Davis, read Bell Hooks. Like these women were also part of the second wave feminist movement. Like
Absolutely.
it's not
Abs-
just holding one up as a canon, and maybe that's what it is do you think that that's threatening to certain people to like challenge themselves to
Sure,
think outside that
sure.
kind of canon system?
Sure, sure. And to be clear, cite and engage with people in the canon, right? But I think I want to kind of push people to learn from groups of people who maybe they don't necessarily regularly engage with, and opening ourselves up to challenging ourselves in some way, right? Like I think for so many people, they're kind of socialized in a very particular context, a very particular pedigree. And I think that learning requires being open-minded to learning about different experiences, even if they differ from your own, because I think we can learn so much from each other in that way. In
Yeah,
that
and
way.
with America's 250th, I've been challenging myself to get more books from the library that are like uh Black as Fuck History. That book, like,
Yeah, is
I'm really
excellent.
excited to read, Native American history,
Yeah,
like indigenous histories and just histories, like even hood feminism. I
love that
really
book.
want to read that book. Um, yeah, just kind of like challenging myself to like continue to not hold on to one specific narrative.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, because you brought up the kind of erotic empowerment and liberation, so one of the things that I want to challenge some kind of mainstream discourses around is the way that people talk about empowerment, right? I think, I mean,
Mm.
depending on, the media we consume and the communities we're a part of, empowerment in some ways has become this buzzword, right?
Mm.
And it's like, especially in the wake of a lot of like boss bitch feminism and kind of
Mel
everybody's
Robbins, Let Them theory.
right, and we're
Yeah.
all empowered, and I think it's kind of just lost its teeth. It's lost its political orientations, right? Like for me, empowerment, and there's this kind of like neoliberal takeover, if you will, of empowerment, right? That empowerment becomes, especially erotic empowerment, becomes something that you buy, right? So you go on the retreat and you are now empowered, or you do this or you take this class. Right, I took a class on tantric, right? So, and now I'm empowered, right? And I think I really want us to understand empowerment, both as a kind of political experience, and a profoundly somatic and embodied one, right?
Well,
Which is very different from liberation, right? Because to me, erotic or sexual liberation requires dismantling systems of power, right? So empowerment is more of a kind of individual experience, divorced from, sexual liberation, which requires actually dismantling systems of power.
yeah, and you've led us there, which I'm so excited, Angela, which is how does capitalism, American capitalism, play a role in holding people back from understanding their own eroticism?
Well, I think one thing that's become really interesting, I think, especially in late stage capitalism, and I write a lot about this in the chapter on kind of like sex toys and sex robots and sex dolls, which is just to say that there's a lot of ways in which our access to whether it's sexual knowledge, sexual literacy, sexual experiences, right? Like there's also in the chapter on kind of swingers, where I just talk about that entire industry, right? So you're talking about, again, a transnational industry that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So sexuality has been commodified in ways that I think that we need to be talking about, right? So to the extent that, kind of being, if for some people, being really erotically empowered is about what equipment and what toys and what things you can consume rather than thinking about your self-knowledge, your relationship to your own body, what your body likes, what your body enjoys, what you need, because sometimes we miss, and that's part of the crux of the book, we miss the kind of political and social dimensions of our sexuality, right? That feeling safe, feeling good, feeling pleasure in our bodies often requires us to be able to articulate needs and boundaries to other people and is predicated on the behaviors of other people, right? And so again, I want us to think about empowerment and sexuality in less commodified ways, and thinking about how we can use some of the tools presented in the book, especially connecting our sexualities to the kind of social world and the political landscape, how we can use that kind of new framework to better understand ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm gonna bring up, so Jay is gonna come on the podcast later. He
Okay.
wrote this book called Village Dreams about like 60s, 70s, um, very queer male kind of culture in New York
Hmm.
City. And he responded to you, and I thought it was a really productive conversation.
Yeah.
And I was curious for you to address it, which is I do think there is this narrative, and it's that counterculture, Hair the musical, the hippie movement, like sex was liberated, it was out in the public. But my question is, well, how about how a lot of those in the counterculture 60s movement then voted for Reagan, or the repressive kind of elements that started to happen in American society? And in the 60s and 70s, was the mainstream American public still understanding sexuality and their bodies? Or was
Yes.
it just on the fringes? Or like they
Hmm.
kind of like said, well, there's this movement going on, but we can still behave the way we're behaving without acknowledging it.
Hmm. I really appreciated that exchange, and I would have continued going, like not to digress too much away from your question, but like I really appreciate good faith debate. It's
Mhm.
when debate is not in good faith that I kind of often tune out, boundary, we're not going there. But I love this question, which is just because I think in some ways that comment tapped into a paradox that I'm trying to grapple with in the book, which is in some ways, sex is everywhere. So how can it be everywhere and so open, but yet in some ways still be an open secret? In some ways, it's this thing that seems to be smattered everywhere in public culture. But yet, and certainly depending on where we're talking about in the world, but if we're looking at the US context in this moment, that it can somehow be everywhere, but yet there's still elements or dimensions of sexuality that can be less talked about or talked about in ways that aren't accurate, right? So people are maybe talking about sex, but in what ways are they doing that? Are they doing that in ways that reflect kind of deep sexual literacy? Are they talking about sex in ways that are profoundly inaccurate? And when I say inaccurate, not necessarily rooted in kind of science or empirical information, right?
Mhm.
So even if sex is everywhere in some ways, I still worry in some ways about people's sexual literacy, right? So even if sex is everywhere, we still can't seem to address or frankly have any interest in addressing sexual violence or any of the issues that come along with sexuality. So again, it's this paradox where for some people they might say it's kind of open and it's everywhere, but there are still all these problems surrounding sexuality that we don't seem or have a willingness to address. And so that concerns me. And I think the other thing that I really want for people that I think is really important is that, especially if you're watching, if you're listening, if you live in the US, I think it's really important that we connect our sexualities to the world, right? to the world around us. And in some ways, that can help people even just kind of reflect on certain privileges that they might have, right? When we put ourselves in a global context and thinking more about kind of the way that there's a lot of similarities around the kind of hegemonic structures that shape sexuality, the political forces that control sexuality. There's a lot of similarities around the world, and there are certainly lots of places around the world where people are not openly talking about sexuality and have a different vernacular and different languages and different customs and different ideas about what's acceptable to talk about and what's not acceptable. So yeah, I just think like all things, I think it's messy and complicated.
Yeah, well, and I'm so curious, like when students of yours are bringing up heated rivalry, which, we couldn't have gone anywhere without mentioning that, but I feel like a show like that, at the same time though, TikTok, Instagram, there's all these male comedians like using pegging as a punchline. So it's like, is that really empowered? Um, or is that still kind of using kink or fetish culture as humor and not taking certain things seriously? I mean, right, I guess we could tackle the heated rivalry first. Is my question with a show like that and its popularity is, does that necessarily mean, in your opinion, that the pop culture world is like understanding the messiness of sexuality, or did it just happen to a
Ooh.
certain sports phenomenon that it was like just right, like the
Mm.
romance narrative kind of just like hit at the right time?
Yeah.
Why does anything exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? I think that's a question we all, as curious people, have asked ourselves. And let me tell you, Professor Stephen A. Simon's new book is so thought provoking that I can't wait for you all to pick it up. He provides his experience as a professor of political science and philosophy to explore that question with such a variety of perspectives from science, religion, philosophy, and even mathematics. He helps us understand what could possibly explain the most fundamental fact of all, that anything exists. So you can get this from broadviewpress.com. The floodgates have opened with science fiction as a genre in my life because I owe this to my husband and I'm going to give him credit. He has really gotten me to think more about sci-fi, film, and literature. I have to say, Minority Report, absolutely amazing. And Alien, I mean, who doesn't love that alien coming out of that human body in the first film? So, Professor Jason Haslam's new anthology provides a lot of exploration with all different short fiction, so many sci fi authors, over 200 years, including sci fi that explores indigenous futurism, feminist science fiction, Afrofuturism. Again, you can get this on broadviewpress.com. And last but not least, my upcoming episode with Professor Matthew James Vachinsky explores his book, which is Original Inquiry, a guide to research for undergraduates, a great toolkit for all faculty out there who are just trying to find a book that helps their students understand how to collect research sources and then, right, the hardest part, build and organize their essay with all of these sources and to make a cohesive argument. I can't recommend Original Inquiry highly enough. So again, all three books can be found on broadviewpress.com. Use the promo code Ivory Tower for 20% off.
This is one of those questions where, again, I think we could have an entire episode. And
Yeah.
there are certainly episodes devoted to unpacking, many platforms devoted to unpacking heated rivalry. I think there's a lot of things that appeal to people there. But I think one of them that, again, speaks to some of the arguments in the book is I think that it was, back up for a second, because I think it was interesting that I think there was one set of reactions that I saw to heated rivalry was like, ooh, people like it because it's so sexually explicit and it's like, it's not porn, but it's walking right up to that line. Like there are certain scenes that are like walking right up to that kind of pornographic line. But for me, I think it had less the general appeal, and especially the appeal amongst straight women in particular, but amongst straight folks in particular, has a lot to do with the intersections between gender and sexuality, and more specifically masculinity and eroticism and sexuality, that I think the connection between the two of them, there's an intimacy that undergirds their interactions, their sexual encounters. There's an eroticism that I think people are really drawn to that isn't just about sex for sex sake.
Mm,
If that makes sense.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think, listen, if you're a sports person, maybe there's also something to like, again, seeing out players in a context where you don't normally see that. So I think the show is just doing a lot of wonderful things.
Yeah, and like romance bookstores are all the rage right now. I feel like as a genre, it kind of like a male romance. I mean, right, we could spend, like you said, a whole episode about like identity and racial politics. What if the men weren't chiseled and looked like, ancient Greek statues? How would that have gone over?
Right.
But it's kind of like, as academics, we love saying, well, if you are interested in this narrative, I recommend this. It's like a text, like a film that I think doesn't get discussed as much as Moonlight. And I thought what Moonlight
Hmm.
did was so fascinating with, a queer black experience, the nuances of that experience, like coming
Hmm.
out and,
Hmm. Hmm.
his mother's relationship, which is just a heartbreaking
Yeah.
performance. But yeah, that's a film that
Yeah.
I think my question is, like, as a, you know, fortune teller of sorts, is like, well, does that mean, does that necessarily translate to, more studios producing this kind of work
Exactly.
and increasing more nuanced narratives? Or is it just like lightning in a bottle and then we move on? I
Exactly.
don't know.
And I think this goes back to, I'm also going to connect this question
Yeah.
before about like, well, if sexuality is seemingly open and we're constantly seeing sexuality on public display, whose bodies, whose sexualities are we constantly seeing on display? Moonlight was such a stunning, stunning film, but how often can you say in mainstream popular media you see the centering of queer black men? Right? Maybe I'm like Noah's Ark. Like I have to sit and like go back and think, and maybe in some cases you can identify, I don't know, a few on one hand as compared to a broader body of media that centers, like you were saying before, young, fit, white, cis, right? And so even if we can point to, again, the beauty of shows like Pose, right? Like I'm so grateful
Yes.
that these shows exist. The Watermelon Woman. Like I think there are a number of different films along the way that we can point to that are showing a greater diversity along racial lines, along gendered lines, but they're very often few and far between as compared to what we've seen. Something go back to my students that I was asking my students last semester in my class on sexualities, we were talking a lot about sexuality and disability, right?
Mm.
When was it? Like quickly, and I'm like, quickly, can you name a show? Because they love talking about media, right? And so, like, name a show or name any genre of media in which you have seen a person with disabilities and you've been introduced to their sexual lives, right? Or they have been presented with sexual agency.
Mm.
And it's usually like crickets, you know. Maybe if students watch the reboot of the L Word, there was like one scene where there was a trans man of color with a Latina woman who uses a chair, right? But that was like the one example that we could come up with, right? So I think this point is really important.
Yeah. And like, do you think that, when you have to kind of situate your work in sexuality studies right now, I mean, and I think maybe this
Mm,
gets to the heart of what your work is doing, which is so exciting, is kind of like you've said, American sexualities, we need to also connect it to the global
mhm.
world. Is can we easily like all say, oh, this is where sexuality studies is right now? Or is that not the point? Is the point that we have gone in so many different directions because we are living in a global
Mhm.
economy and society of sorts?
Yeah. Um, I would say there's still a number of limitations in sexualities research, but I think one of the things I set up in one of the earlier chapters is kind of history of sexology. So I think the one thing, and again, this is to be kind of generous to my own field, is that I think this is really still in some ways a nascent field, especially for those of us who are looking at sexuality through kind of social frameworks, as opposed to, I think there's a bit longer history of sexologists looking at sexuality through biological frameworks and psychological frameworks, but taking seriously the kind of social life of sexuality. I mean, we're talking about, 4 decades, like we're not 5 decades, we're not talking about a very long history. And so I think we've made a lot of progress in that way. I think there are still a number of kind of gaps or limitations for me. I wish that far more sexuality scholars were doing interdisciplinary work. And because one of the things that I argue in this book, and just to come back to a comment I made a second ago, this book is deeply informed by physiology and bodies and psychological perspectives, but it's also indebted to the social. And I don't think that we should try to disentangle that heap of knots, right? Like, I think all of those perspectives, all of those disciplinary perspectives are really important to understand sexuality holistically. We've already talked about, I think it's really important to see more work that is using intersectional frameworks, that's thinking about how factors like gender, race, class, ability, all these different facets shape our sexual lives and erotic lives differently, and then transnationally and internationally. And thinking, and when I say transnationally, it's not just international, right? It's not just that I think we need to be looking at sexuality in different places, but rather trying to understand the connections between our erotic lives across, human-made boundaries. And then the last thing I'll say that I think is really important is that, and one of the contributions I think this book is making is to really ask us to think about sexuality holistically, because one of the things that I see a lot happen, especially in mainstream discourses, there's often a conflation between sex and sexuality, right? And so this book is about sexuality, and it's offering a new framework that I call the erotic power model, to think about 5 different facets of our sexuality, right? So if folks who are listening, watching, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about sexuality, right? And I think that for some people, maybe that's identity, or maybe that's sex, right? But our sexualities are multifaceted, and this is about our desires that connect with our behaviors, that connect with our identities, that connect with our relationships, that connect with our communities, right? And so, really wanting to understand sexuality in a more holistic way.
Mm. No,
Mm.
thank you for that,
Yep.
Angela. And is it okay if we go for like another five
I,
minutes?
I'm here.
Okay, or 10 minutes?
I
Okay.
am here
I'm
for
having
it. I am
such,
here
this
for
is
it.
such
Me
a
too. I
fabulous
am here for it. I
conversation.
am here for it.
So do you think that, being situated in a gender and sexuality program, like, it seems like right now, there is a lot of discourse around decentering, say, the waves of feminism, for example. But do you think that I do feel like there's a lot of decentering happening in gender, but I understand what you're saying about sexuality studies being so new of a field, which is true. I also am kind of curious about like a type of study that in the 90s emerged. I mean, 80s, I guess you could point to, um, with Linda Williams, I think,
Hmm.
with porn studies. And I had on Tim Dean a few years ago to talk about
He's
unlimited
great.
intimacy. I know
Yeah, he's
that
great.
book to me was
He's
so
great.
fascinating. Like, where has porn studies gone? Do you think that sounds like a panel
Mm.
question,
Right.
but where has it gone? But do you think that sexuality studies, like, are we in a moment right now in American universities where these courses are being offered, or has there been a type of pressure to kind of silence certain uh, conversations, or, try to shift the conversation away because of where we are politically?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a really complicated one. So I'll try to give it some nuance. I think there's still, even now, a lot of pushback to certain themes or subject matter within sexualities, right? So maybe one entry kind of point to answering this is, when I think about funding for sexualities research, right? So if I'm doing a study that is specifically about public health, that is about HIV, there is, I mean, even now, there's still a certain amount of funding available for that research. But if you want to write about sexuality and orgasms, and not in a clinical dysfunction type of way, right? Where we're not centering what I call the three disease, the three Ds, like disease, dysfunction. Um, but you want to write about sexuality and pleasure, right? And agency. There's rarely any funding for that type of research. So just as an example of kind of where people's priorities. So yes, this work is proliferating, but I think in really uneven ways. So thinking again thematically or topically. If you're writing about kind of any kind of, you were talking before about like countercultures, right? So which countercultures? Right? And are you talking about kind of historically situated ones, like ones from the past? Are you talking about contemporary kind of subcultures? How deviant are they in the public perception or in, the eyes of other academics, right? So there might be less openness to studying, again, people engaged in BDSM than there are in, I don't know, nudists or something, right? So I
Mhm,
think
mhm,
kind of
mhm.
thematically that matters. I think you brought up feminism. I mean, feminists have been, and I talk about this in the book too, because I think there's some, for those who are familiar with the sex wars, right, amongst feminists, there have been these long-standing debates about sexuality as a site of exploitation, right, versus as a site of empowerment and pleasure. And I think, for many of us, the answer is like most things, it's not binary, right? Like sexuality is a site of both. It is a site of both exploitation and of pleasure. And I think this is even in porn studies, this is the dominant framework, right? So moving away from just thinking about whether it's porn or sex work more broadly, these are not industries that are just inherently exploitative or inherently kind of empowering or pleasurable. And especially if we're talking about sex work, like any job, right? It's probably some mix of both. Yeah, if it's helpful, there's also a section in the chapter on sex dolls, where I talk about a kind of sex wars reboot amongst feminists who are kind of using the growth of industries around sex dolls as a place to have this very familiar debate about, they're exploitative, we need to prohibit them, they are terrible, and then others kind of pointing to them as this, this tool of pleasure, right? When in the end, again, it's probably the site of both.
Mm. So, you brought up media, and I have to ask you, like podcasts, have shifted the landscape a lot. I mean, I think in great ways you can access conversations that, or topics maybe that won't get published right away. And I'm thinking the popularity of a show like Sex with Emily.
Mhm.
Um, like, do you think that shows like her popularity, for example, do you think that it has really helped give language to people and open up conversations instead of kind of like, bringing up swingers, making like an upside down pineapple into just a joke? That it's
Yep.
like, oh no, these are actually serious communities, and we don't need to like
Right.
turn every kind of, you know, type of sex practice into a punchline.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that there's so much, and this is why I was pointing to the Black polyamorous educators who are doing so much work online. And I think there's so many people, like Emily, like others, who are online educating people, trying to help people improve their sexual literacy, have more profoundly consensual, profoundly pleasurable, erotic lives. And I think they're doing really, really important work. To the extent that there are some moments where, and I say this very often when I talk about sex work, which is a lot of the research that I've done over the past decade, and that I think it's really important to center learning from people in those communities, right? Like, I think it is important. I think research is important, and perhaps reading academic texts about sexuality are important. But I think it's really important to read from, listen to the people who are directly a part of those communities, and very often in ways where you have free access to that information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that um have you been surprised, or have there been challenges with your students, specifically with like them growing up in the digital age of
Mm.
TikTok, that do they have more of a language and a nuance around sexuality? This like idea of intersectional sexuality, or do you think that there's still certain kinds of narratives that they're being fed in the algorithm on TikTok?
Oof. Again, another great question. Really complicated because again, I want to come back to the importance of intersectionality when I think about that question because how I would answer that really depends on which students I'm talking about. I mean, I think
Mhm.
that there are students who, in the context of a class on sexuality, who will come in with a lot of information. And then there are students who will come in with far less information. And a lot of that having to do with the cultural landscape in which they were raised, right? Like how they were raised, their family's religious background, right? So I think there's
Mhm.
just so many factors that shape that. I have students who can't get off of TikTok. I have students who refuse to create TikTok accounts, right? So
Yeah.
I think there's just so much variation there.
Yeah.
Um,
So like a show that just ended is Euphoria. Not sure if you saw it.
I did
Okay,
most of
I
it
did
anyway.
too.
I
And
was
I
like, why
have
am I still here?
yeah, and I have to ask you,
It's
so
like, why am I
like
still here?
Sydney Sweeney's character
Yeah,
starting in OnlyFans, which became like this whole, her
storyline.
trying to like break into the content creator
Mm-mm.
business, which she did like do successfully with Maddie at her side. Do you think that that gives more uh of an optimistic view of where, the TV landscape's going, or do you feel like it kind of just collapsed back in on itself? Like, oh, wait, this is still kind of like the Playboy model. Like, have we really shifted that far
Mm-mm.
from women's
Mm-mm.
bodies being objectified, or does she
Mm-mm.
really have a lot of agency here?
I don't listen. One of the reasons why this last season was very hard for me to get through, and I didn't actually get through the whole thing. I kind of skipped and then read some spoilers. Um, I found this particular season incredibly horphobic. I thought it was profoundly problematic in its treatment of sex work, but the bar is very low in media when it comes to sex work. It is very rare, outside of independent media produced and created by sex workers. It is very rare to find portraits of sex workers that are rooted in any kind of accuracy, I think. And for me, between what was going on both with Sydney Sweeney's character, what was going on with Rue in
Hmm.
the kind of strip club and all the things that were going on there. There were just so many toxic tropes being reproduced there that, and especially to come back to her character, like in OnlyFans, even if there was some kind of agency there, it was all flattened for me by all of the toxic tropes that it was replicating. Because in the end, I think the messaging was that like sex work is bad, and that sex workers are bad and pathological and problematic. So I think the whole kind of portrait of sex work in this last season was really hard to watch for me.
Yeah, it made me want to like, you know, turn to Hustlers, that film, which I thought, again, any film is going to have its,
Sure.
we could find critiques, but I did
Sure.
think the different um, racial identities, the different socioeconomic background of the characters in Hustlers,
Yeah.
you know, was more um there were more like ways and layers to look at than, you're right, than what's
Yeah.
happening with even Rue's position there. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was
Yeah. It was so focused on
it was
exploitation. I mean,
yeah.
I guess there was one, if I'm gonna again try to be generous for a moment. I think the introduction of Maddie's character as a kind
Mm,
of exploitative third party was interesting because I think in the dominant, kind of cultural landscape, when we think about exploitative third parties in sex industries, we think of cis men. And so I think the way that they presented her character and the work that the exploitative, I thought, or read as exploitative way that she was kind of managing
mhm.
women was an interesting portrait, but
Yeah.
overall, really problematic for me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it kind of begged the question, was like Maddie, um Sydney Sweeney's pimp of sorts. Like, which then I guess, yeah. I mean, we'll let others do the Euphoria analysis because, yeah, it was very toxic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that director, he clearly gets off on exploitative narratives,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and
Um,
shock.
and shock, right? Because
Shock.
that's what it was for me too. I was just like, okay, a lot of this just feels like shock value. Like at this point, like we're just doing these shocking things. I don't see the kind of character development that I saw in the beginning, the attention to writing that I saw in the beginning. So,
Yeah, yeah. So like what are you now consuming, right? Like everyone is going to get their hands
ooh.
on sex in public. So like I'm curious, like where is your headspace now, right? Like who else
Mm.
would you recommend to read or things to watch like after they get done reading your work?
Yeah. So, colleague and dear friend of mine who I mentioned a number of times in the book. So, Brandon Robinson has a book out that came out in, I apologize if I'm getting this wrong, Brandon, March earlier this year, called Trans Pleasure. That's
Mhm.
really wonderful because again, I think that's doing kind of similar work around not just wanting to portray trans lives as a space of misery and trauma and pain, but
Mhm.
centering trans pleasure and joy, and especially in a kind of romantic sense. So I think that that book is doing really important work. I would really highly recommend that to folks as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, thank you so much, Angela. And
of course.
we'll have to definitely I'm gonna have you back on, like
Yes.
specifically when there's like a film or a TV show that's like coming out. I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I haven't seen any film trailers recently that has like jumped out at me with the messiness of sexuality,
Yeah.
but we'll see. Right now I feel like a
Yeah, we'll
lot
see. I'm
of the
trying to think, but maybe, yeah.
Yeah, like right now, everything that I have been really interested in is like the indie horror scene. Obsession. Well, actually, Obsession does get into sexuality. I mean,
Yeah.
about, pleasure and a woman losing her ability to give consent.
Hmm.
Um, and the effects of that. But yeah, I feel like the horror space is doing a lot right now. Where is it the most interesting for me right now when it comes to
For the film.
sexuality?
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. I don't know what that says
Yeah.
about. Maybe that definitely says something about our society right now. Because usually horror is popular when the political system is uh regressive.
Yes. Right. Equally horror.
Equally horrific.
Equally horrific and terrifying.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Well, and even like I was thinking of you've really made me want to reread Bell Hooks with the idea of like um erotic empowerment, transgressive pedagogy. I mean, just
yeah.
your book is part of such an amazing
I appreciate
tradition
that.
and just questioning boundaries. I think
Thank
it's
you.
so important.
Thank you. I
So very
appreciate that.
important.
Yes. And if people are looking for perhaps older texts than not
Yeah.
newer ones, so much of my theorizing of eroticism is really indebted to a long line of Black feminist thinkers. So I think starting with a text by Audre Lorde called The Uses of the Erotic is really important. Um, I would read, if folks haven't, Jennifer Nash's The Black Body in Ecstasy. There's Murray Miller Young's A Taste of Brown Sugar. Arian Cruz's The Color of Kink. So I think if you're looking for kind of older, especially not that old, but Black feminist texts, I think there's a lot of folks writing about sexuality in ways that are really, really helpful, right? Because they're helping us to think about how we both capture power and pleasure, right? So going back to the how do we make space and not let systems of power off the hook, but while leaving space for agency and pleasure. And I think Black feminists do that really well.
Yeah. And how we're all part of this capitalist, late stage capitalist horror show.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, one of my, again, not recent, although I know Heather Burke has a new book coming out soon with Duke University Press that I can't wait for. But Heather Burke's book, Porn Work, is really phenomenal for
Mm.
anybody who wants to learn more about contemporary porn industries, and in a way that's profoundly ethical. and really, really attentive to capitalism.
Okay,
And
well,
it's
I'm
and
gonna
it's and
read.
its myriad of problems.
No, I'm gonna get my hands on that. And everyone you mentioned, if they're listening, I'd love to have them on the show too, to continue these
I can make
conversations.
some of those connections if you
Thank you,
want.
Angela.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
everyone, sex in public, the transformative social power of our erotic lives. I've been reading it at the pool. I think it's a great
Woo!
cover. I think, it'll open the door to conversations, which I think is the whole point
I
too,
love that.
right?
Exactly. I was going to ask you, has anybody approached you? Because I love that. Like
Not yet,
I
but
love
I
that.
will
I
let
love
you know.
it.
I will let you know. And well, and I think it's great because it's a good opening for like, why should why would someone have like a stigma even for a title like this?
Exactly. Or like, I'm curious, take notes. If you're reading, like, do you see anybody grimace or look at you funny? Like, ooh, what are you reading in public?
Yeah, so if you're on the
You little
subway,
nasty man, what are you
you
reading?
know, on the subway, make sure you have the book open and like
Exactly.
you could do that for like a TikTok. There you go, in case
Exactly.
anyone wants to
Exactly.
jump on that. But you can get it
Right?
from Seal Press, available, any bookstore. Bookshop.org is a great one. And, Angela, this has just been so fabulous having
So
you
much fun.
on.
So much
Oh,
fun.
and what is your Instagram for everyone to follow you?
At Angela J. Writer.
Okay, great. So I can't wait to have you back. We'll have to
Thank
we'll
you so
figure out
much.
something. And yeah, happy Pride. I mean,
Happy
this
Pride.
is a
Yeah.
great text to add to your
Yes, it
Pride reading
is.
list.
That's why I was very, oh, I was like, we're coming out in June. I love it.
Yes,
Perfect.
yes, yes. Couldn't have timed it better. Well, this was
Perfect.
so wonderful. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you so much.